right, George. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. Before I go on, I would like you to introduce yourself because you're a man of many talents, but I do not want to take that hat. So tell me what you do.
Thank you very much, Vera, for having me. My name is George Nyabuga.
Professor.
Yes, uh, Professor George Nyabuga. I work at two universities, the Aga Khan University, Graduate School of Media and Communications.
Hmm.
I also work at the University of Nairobi, the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, formerly the School of Journalism.
Hmm. Thank you so much. So, you and I have had this conversation about the relationships academics and researchers in the South have with the North, and it has always been like, oh, something is wrong, something is wrong. So today I would like us to explore what you think we can do to ensure that we are always not whining as people from the South. First of all, do you really think we need these relationships like the North South? Do we need it?
I think there's been a lot of lamentations, as you said. And I think the current discussions, around finding solutions to some of the challenges that we have. And we can never actually work alone,
Mm-hmm.
whether universities in the south or the north, because knowledge is global these days, and the production of knowledge and
Mm-hmm.
consumption of knowledge is
Right.
global. So the collaborative efforts, the partnerships that are developed between the universities in the
Right.
north, or
Right.
the funders or the sponsors of
Mm-hmm.
any research,
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of research then that is conducted in Africa
Yeah.
is beneficial not only to the donors or the universities in the north, but also to the universities in the south. So they might provide, for example, the funding, but we also
Right.
provide the people and the facilities to do the research. And those opportunities are always important. Given, as I said, the global nature of knowledge, but also knowledge that is relevant,
Yeah.
knowledge that is recent, knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that is current, so that whatever issues that we teach, for example, is illustrated by evidence that is current rather than perhaps knowledge that was produced many years ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good to hear. But in obviously the thing has not. If it was equal, we wouldn't be having these lamentations. I would like to know whether, first of all, you've participated in any North South collaboration and what your experience was in relation to the things you've just told me. What was the benefit? Did you feel you were, I don't want to say exploited, but how was it? Give me an example of a relationship you've had before.
We had a 5-year project funded by the Swiss government.
Mm-hmm.
And this collaboration involved 4 African universities,
Right,
actually 5, because in Kenya we had University of Nairobi,
right.
where of course I am, and the University of Embu, but
Mm-hmm.
also brought in KALRO, Kenya Agricultural Livestock,
Mm-hmm.
the organization that does a lot of research in
Right.
agriculture. We
Mm-hmm.
also had a university in Zambia, we had a
Mm-hmm.
university in Mali, and a university in Ghana,
Mm-hmm.
and of course our funders in Switzerland in the north.
Okay.
And this was an equal.
It was equal.
It was equal, uh, uh,
Okay.
relationship in the sense that we provided, for example, research sites, research facilities, and they provided the funding. And we had meetings in all the countries, the research countries.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very beneficial, so symbiotic relationship that I don't think exploited us as researchers, exploited us as maybe
Right.
scholars,
Right.
because what they did was fund PhD students and master's students to produce knowledge that was relevant to the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
And this was on organic farming and organic soil management, particularly. So, issues of, for example, synthetic fertilizer
Right.
and chemicals that are used
Right.
in agriculture. And these guys were, interested in organic farming. How
Mm-hmm.
can we benefit from organic farming without, spoiling our soils, if you
I
may?
wonder what a
Because
journalist was doing in that project.
Oh, well, there's a lot of agricultural communication is big,
Oh, so you're doing
and food security is a big issue.
okay.
And I'm sure you've seen all these TV stations investing
Right.
in,
Right.
agriculture and agricultural, programming or content production that relates to, how to enhance
Mm-hmm.
agricultural production, how
Mm-hmm.
to enhance food security. And I think that is very, very important at the moment. Because our soils are actually declining. The fertility of those soils are declining because of use of organic fertilizer, chemical fertilizer, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to these technologies that are supposed to enhance
Okay.
soil fertility. So we're using, there's a lot of indigenous knowledge, I should say, that ought to be celebrated, ought to be curated, and ought to be used to enhance our own agricultural practices. And that's where journalism is.
Ah, I
Yes.
can see where you come in. Obviously, not so many people have had an experience like you, as you feel it wasn't exploitative and it was okay. So, what did you guys do to make sure that you are not exploited? Is there something on your part? Your part, I mean, the people from the south, that you made sure from right from the beginning, this is not going to be something that will because I'm seeing multiple options there. They could have taken the data, that indigenous knowledge, they could have patented it. So, what did you guys do to make sure that this thing is equal?
First is they were uh, the funding
Yeah.
was meant to sponsor PhD students.
Right.
So over the 5 years, we produced so many PhDs, we produced so many masters,
Right. Okay.
masters,
Mm.
and out of those, we produced so many journal articles that would benefit, um, our own students,
Right.
but also our own farmers and scholars.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that we did in Kenya,
Mm-hmm.
particularly as part of the project, was engage in agricultural communication, and
Yeah.
as part of that research was going on to radio and using the knowledge that we had generated from the research to communicate with farmers to tell them what it is that we had found out. So, for example, research in Kandara, and this is in Muranga,
Right.
research in
Mm-hmm.
Tharaka-Nithi, research in Embu, and we used radio stations in those places, and this was local language radio stations.
So
Uh,
basically, the knowledge you produced came back to
Yes,
help you guys.
benefited the
Okay.
farmers. And
Right.
we actually did an endline survey where we went back and
Uh
asked the
huh.
farmers, did you
Yeah.
listen to these programs? What do you think benefited you out of, the programs that you listened to? Can you apply the knowledge
Mm-hmm.
that you have, for example, gained the knowledge that you've acquired from the radio stations? And many of them were actually very happy.
Okay.
And some of the people that were involved in the radio programs were local people, local scientists, and
Mm-hmm.
people that worked in those communities.
So I'm hearing the second thing is that you made sure that the staff in the project were local.
Yes.
What they paid, if you could say, fairly as compared to their Western counterparts.
Maybe not as compared to their Western counterparts, because I don't know what their Western counterparts
Okay,
earn.
but by
But
market rates in
by
Kenya.
market rates, because these, for example, local extension officers,
Uh
for
huh.
instance, people that are not remunerated well by
Mm-hmm.
the government at the moment,
Okay.
people that are retired from being extension officers, people that work in plant pathology, for example, or animal husbandry. And these
Mm-hmm.
are then people that are knowledgeable
Okay.
in these matters,
Mm-hmm.
and it is utilizing that knowledge to enhance, local knowledge. And to enhance, as I said, farming, and ultimately, of course, then food security.
Uh
And there's
huh.
so many important matters. But maybe the Swiss are not exploitative in this context. But also, we went into that project as partners, and not that one body was funding us, and we was then supposed to
Kind
produce
of
the.
like work for them.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, we didn't work for them. This was a
You
partnership.
work with.
We worked with them.
Okay. So what I'm hearing there is also framing the language of how the relationship comes. It's not we are being funded and we are working for. It's more like we are working with. Um, do you think
Yes,
language played an important thing in ensuring that that relationship is fair and balanced?
definitely. I mean, the proposal itself, the way it was framed,
Mm.
those guys came in with the money, but the researchers were local researchers.
Okay.
So the agronomists, for example, here, the communication experts were Kenyan experts
Right.
and African experts in the other, countries that I mentioned.
Right.
So they provided the funding, but all the advice, for example, that they received was based on, local expertise.
Okay.
So Kenyan communication experts, because our relation, our part was the communication now element.
Mm-hmm.
It might have been agricultural, research in agriculture, but there are so many elements in that, agricultural research. So
Right.
there's communication, for example, that is
Right.
oftentimes lacking in that
Right.
kind of science. And so how can we, for example, communicate messages and frame messages so that they're understandable to the local communities?
Uh-huh.
You don't frame it in scientific language, then people will find very difficult to understand. We wanted to make it as accessible as possible, as simple as possible, so that
Mm.
even the people that are not literate, agricultural
Can
literate,
get it.
can get it and
Okay.
can benefit from that knowledge.
Okay. So I hear a lot of, if I were to write it down, I would list the things that you did. But I'm sure you've talked to your colleagues. They tell you, oh my God, I feel so exploited. And these conversations, they have been going on, especially during COVID. What are some of the things that you think, as people in the South, we do to, should I say, make ourselves vulnerable to being exploited? Do you think we, first of all, do you think we can make ourselves vulnerable to being exploited in these relationships?
Definitely. I mean, we've had colleagues from, for example, the universities who say that the relationship is not equal.
Mhm.
These scientists come in with the money, and they collect the data, and perhaps sometimes even take it back to their own countries
Yeah.
for analysis. And from whatever it is that they generate,
Yeah.
that knowledge is used mainly for the benefit of the funders. So let's take, for example, medical research. They come here
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
research, say, COVID. The subjects, the the subjects will be local people, and they can take it back to their countries and utilize it there, mainly because they funded the organization. They wrote the proposal without the involvement
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
locals, and
Hmm.
consequently, the only thing that our local colleagues do is be part of, say, field research. And that is why ours, we participated in the proposal writing. So we mentioned, for example, exactly what it is that we wanted to do, how we were going to,
So
to be
number
involved.
one, you're saying like the researchers from the South, they delegate, right from, should I say, work planning? They delegate
From the
it.
proposal, from the conception, from the idea, for example, they are not involved in the coming up with the idea.
Right.
They're not involved in proposal writing. And if you're not involved in proposal writing, then you
Absolutely.
just become a worker. A worker who's being
Who
told,
is implementing
yes,
what someone
yes, what
else?
someone else is doing.
Okay.
So they come here, for example, you are the field officers, you're the research assistants, if you may. Yes, you're getting your pay, and as we know, scholars are not sometimes paid very well, or that they want to be involved in some sort of research, but
Mm-hmm.
their names will not appear, for
Ah.
instance, in the journal articles,
Mm.
other than perhaps in the footnote that they thank this number of people for participating in data collection.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
awful.
So, at the end of the day, you do not get the acknowledgement that you deserve
For the
in,
hard work
yes,
that
for
you
the
put
hard work
in.
that you've put in. You don't
Absolutely.
become a co-author of the articles, for instance. And at the end of the day, the credibility then goes to the researchers.
Mm-hmm.
Researchers, not the people that actually participate in the research itself.
Okay. I can see why, if I'm a junior researcher, for instance, I just got my PhD, I'm looking for a job. But then the environment at home also, you know, I'm looking for something to work and earn a living. Do you think also there are certain factors in our local, national research infrastructure that makes it possible for these Western countries to come and take advantage of us? Do you think that's the case?
Definitely. I mean, first
Tell me.
is maybe lack of innovative thinking,
Hmm.
and especially in our research
Tell me about
bodies.
that.
government, for example, governments that are not really interested in
You are a
research.
government worker, though.
Yes, yes. Quasi government worker.
Quasi.
Yes,
Okay,
because we
quasi
are fairly
government.
independent.
All
But
right.
let's look at government funding, for instance. There's very little government funding for any research that is
Right.
conducted in this
Right.
country.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the funding comes from Western countries. You
Uh-huh.
go to Cambridge, for example, that researches diseases. You go to the University of Nairobi that researches the diseases.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the funding will come from Western countries. You've
Mm-hmm.
seen Bill and Melinda Gates,
Yeah.
Oxford,
Uh-huh.
and so many other, anyway, so many organizations that bring in the funding. And without that equal relationship, you find that the funders would actually maybe demand and that this is how the research ought to be
Because it's their
conducted
money, right?
because it's their money.
Yeah.
But even if it's their money, it is our evidence, it is our knowledge, it is our um, situation, the subjects that
Which you
would
could
be
have
used.
funded by yourself, right?
I suppose so. I suppose so. But the fact that we are part of the research, it should be an equal relationship rather than an exploitative, relationship as it is. But as you said, funding is a big thing. If I don't have the money, then I'm not going to conduct research. And many of the studies are actually very expensive. You go out into the field,
Mm-hmm.
you have to have the facilities, you
Right.
have to have the equipment. For
Right.
example, in agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
you have to pay the workers. You have to pay for so many things, and
Absolutely.
it's not cheap. And
Absolutely.
if our government then is not putting in funding and is not demanding that if foreigners, for example, put in the money, that this is how then research ought to be conducted. And we know that sometimes that whoever pays the piper calls the tune. And I
Absolutely.
think that is what has been happening in many of the
Uh-huh.
instances that we have here.
And I see, like, we just saw the other time, like, the first act of duty when the cabinet secretary for education came in was to say, oh, we are no longer going to support the university. And we know universities where knowledge is produced and it guides what we do in hospitals, basically policy. So, how do you think, I mean, as academics, what are you supposed to do about that? Because obviously, that taking 10 steps back to the journey you've been making. So, what should you guys do?
First, I should say that the government actually has been putting very little money in higher education.
It's been little.
It's very little money, and
Okay.
most of it is maybe just to pay the wages of the university.
Not for the research.
Not hardly for any research, and there's very little funding that goes to students, especially students in public universities. And so, for the cabinet secretary to say that they're going to cut funding to public universities is a really serious issue. And especially because many of these people in government actually went through,
The same
public
universities.
universities, and they were supported. And I think if we look at the time that they were in universities, the universities used to pay them to come to the university, and they used to pay their fees. And without providing that kind of funding, then you can imagine what is
Mm-hmm.
going to happen in our education sector. It means that
Absolutely.
people will hardly access university education.
Mm-hmm.
People would hardly engage in any serious research in
Mm-hmm.
universities. And accordingly, our universities would just be as they are, I think, mostly at the moment, just teaching universities rather than research
Mm-hmm.
institutions. And we know teaching universities are not ranked up there. So you must be able to conduct research that is relevant, that is current, so that you illustrate the things that you're teaching in universities with practical or knowledge
Absolutely.
that is practical,
Like
knowledge that is,
implementation,
yes,
research,
yes,
basic
knowledge
and
that is,
implementation. Yeah.
yes, knowledge that is relevant. So if and I think this is something that we've talked so many times about,
Absolutely.
that our university education is not relevant anymore. So you go to class and you're told, oh, you go to a computer, say a computer, an IT class,
Mm-hmm.
and you have a computer that is drawn on the board and told this is what a CPU.
Abacus.
Yes, CPU looks like. This is what software looks like.
Mm.
And you leave the university without having used a computer. And that will, you can imagine. So you go into the world that is, globalized, and you're told now, operate a computer,
You
produce
can't do it.
software,
Yeah.
code. You might not be able to do that. You go
I
to a university of
yeah.
journalism, communication, and you're told this is how a studio looks like. You've never
You have
seen a
never been
studio.
into one.
Yes.
I think that's particularly dangerous for the biomedical sciences, where, like, I remember this one time, the bolus, the thing they inject in children, there was a huge row about how that process should be done because of the many reviews that had been done, and some people were not aware about it. Because research, for biomedical research, you do it, it affects how patients are looked after in referral facilities. So what you're saying is really true. However, you also mentioned while we were talking before we came here that, should I say sabotage? The government has also made it impossible for universities to make extra income and therefore not become vulnerable to, this kind of exploitation. Could you give me some of the example that you feel the government, this policy just cut the money source from universities?
I mean, first, I'll use the example of University of Nairobi, where the government at some point said that all the money that was collected from Module 2 students had to go to the treasury, to the
Mm.
exchequer. Before then, the government releases the same amount, the same money to come back to the university.
So
And we
let's
know,
just explain that module two, viewers,
yes,
is
Module 2 is
self-sponsored,
students as
self-sponsored
opposed
student
to government
as
sponsored
opposed to government-sponsored.
sponsored students.
Mm-hmm.
So in Kenya, any student is graduating from high school
Yeah.
normally chooses a university, and you get maybe a certain grade for you to join the university, and you get then admitted by the Kenya Universities and Colleges Placement
Mm-hmm.
Board, COOPS or services. And if you don't get into university using that route, it means then that you have to sponsor yourself. And
Yeah.
those are the Module 2
Uh-huh.
or self sponsored students. And those pay a lot more. The government pays very little for the government sponsored.
Could you give us an example of, say, journalism? What the difference in payment would be for fees
At the moment, I think for Module 2, they pay more than 500,000 shillings.
for the whole course
Not for the whole course,
per year?
per year,
That's $5,000.
about $5,000.
Yeah,
While the government, I think, pays about 48,000 shillings per student, undergraduate students.
that's $480.
Yes, about that. So that's why,
Wow,
university
that's
education was
huge.
affordable if you came in through the government route.
Yep.
And so you can imagine the amount of money that is collected from all those students. And university education then became very attractive because, the job market demanded that, maybe university graduates get the
Absolutely.
first opportunity
Uh-huh.
in the job market. And, the employers also are quite demanding. So in that kind of situation, it means that we used to generate a lot more revenue as universities from the self-sponsored students as opposed to government. And the universities have been struggling for a long time to increase the fees. The fees have never been increased,
Uh-huh.
I think, since the 1990s. And times have changed. The shilling has lost so much value over that period. And anyway, so to go back to the original question,
Yeah.
is if the government demanded that all the money that was collected from the self-paying student goes first to the exchequer before it's released, and oftentimes it would take ages for the money to come back to the universities. It meant that most times the universities were hard up. They couldn't get funding for current
That's
expenditure.
awful. Yeah.
And that meant that many of the programs actually suffered. Lecturers were hardly paid for these,
Mm-hmm.
module two,
Yeah.
teaching in module two. In some instances, some universities like Kenyatta University put all the students together. So module two students or
And
self-sponsored students
in
and
one
the regular students were put together, and that meant that the classes were very big. You can imagine undergraduate classes, first year students. Sometimes there were maybe 1,000 students. Some
in
of
one
them
class.
in one class, and some of them
Wow.
would be sitting outside, um, outside the lecture halls because the lecture halls were not big enough. And so you can imagine the quality of graduates from that kind of, situation. Serious
Obviously, that's
situation. What kind of
1,000
learning would
cannot.
take place in that kind of
Uh-huh.
environment? So, if there was no sufficient funding, or if there's no sufficient funding, and the government then wants to kill the goose that produces the
Ganda. What?
anyway,
No, I'm not good with proverbs.
yeah.
Don't send me see Peter
Anyway,
Sindwell.
yeah. So uh, you kill the goose that produces the golden egg. I think that's what we say, or something like
Okay, it's
that.
the
But we
golden egg.
we check it.
Oh my God, I'll cut out that part for long.
Yeah.
Goose egg.
So yeah. So anyway, it was a very serious situation. I think it's been going on for a long time, and
Mm-hmm.
then the new government now, with the economic situation, does not have sufficient resources to fund,
Yeah,
university
research.
education, research, university education. It doesn't portend very well for the future of
Okay.
university education in this
So
country.
as we wind up, this is my last question. If I was to give it like a listicle, what would you tell the researchers in the South? This is how you need to approach this relationship so that they are equal and they're not exploitative. What would you tell them that they do?
The first thing is to be innovative. Second thing is to take the initiative, become proactive.
Mm,
So rather than waiting, for example, donors or universities or scholars in the north to develop proposals and then use you as a collaborator rather than a partner, uh, I think we should be proactive enough by writing proposals. There are so many, funding bodies in this world, but that
absolutely.
means that you must understand what the challenges are. So that any knowledge that you produce is relevant. At the moment, for instance, there's very little research or studies on COVID-19, on tropical medicine or tropical diseases,
Mm,
that are studies that are done by university scholars from the global south.
right.
Oftentimes, the guys from the north would come in and say, "Can we conduct this research?"
Yeah.
But if we are proactive enough, it means that we are the ones doing. I mean, writing those proposals and then looking for funding. But it is that we must understand what the current environment looks like. We must, for example, research our own COVID
Mm-hmm.
situation
Mm,
by seeking funding and by seeking then partners or collaborators from the north. These are people that might come in and fund, but at the end of the day, the knowledge belongs to us, and we can then share it with the rest of the world for it to be utilized in that environment. So we must be proactive. We must know
innovative.
what the environment looks like. We must be relevant, and we must be sure to produce knowledge that is beneficial not only to us but to the rest of the world. In that situation, we create equal partners rather than, trying to develop that
Absolutely.
unequal relationship in which then it becomes exploitative. The other thing is, of course, our governments must at least, put a certain percentage of our GDPs in research in higher
Yeah.
education, so that we can demonstrate, or they can demonstrate, these governments can demonstrate their interest in higher education, but also research. As we know, any decision that is not research based is, short sighted, if you may. And at the end of the day, this is why you can only find solutions that take care of current, challenges rather than being used for long-term decision making.
Okay. Wow. Those are very insightful answers. I don't know whether there's anything you feel I've not asked that you'd like to, as a professor.
As I suppose there are lots of things that we can deal with. How do we create serious thinkers, for example?
Mm.
How do we deal with a situation where politicians do not lead the way, for example? How do we ensure that the
Lead the way
scholars
for research
for
and
research and for
yeah,
policy making? Because, if we do not contribute to policy, for example, on higher education,
yeah,
research,
absolutely.
and such, then we let the politicians who are not knowledgeable in many of these matters lead
Take the
the way.
lead.
And whenever it is that they take the lead, it's because they want to address some interest, some self-interest,
Yeah,
rather than interest that benefits their
absolutely.
country,
Yeah.
benefits Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as countries in the global south, we must also walk the talk. So Africa has a lot of resources, but how can we utilize those resources to ensure that our education is also relevant? Uh, but also that there's a lot of indigenous knowledge that has never been appreciated, that has never then been utilized. We know that, in our cultures, there are plants, for example, that we use to cure diseases. Many of that knowledge is lost because of lack of documentation. Again, it must be that we put resources in
Into
documenting
that.
that
Yeah.
knowledge, utilizing
Yeah.
that knowledge, and ensuring that it's useful going forward for posterity, of course.
Oh wow. Those are a lot of things to think about. And given that our president is a PhD, why are you laughing?
You're
He's
the
a
one laughing.
PhD.
The environment.
So he's a PhD. I hope he'll take this thing seriously. I mean, he's gone through that. I'm hoping he went through that process of becoming an academic. So I hope he will, in his tenure, he will try and make it bearable
He's a
for research.
politician. He's perhaps not an academic. He's, of course, his background is education. I believe he's been a teacher.
Yeah, he's a teacher.
And yes, then he would understand the importance of
Absolutely.
investing in
In
education,
education.
investing in knowledge production,
And he went
investing,
through
yes,
HELB, Higher Education Loan
yes,
Board, those days.
yes, he
So
did.
he should be able to
Invest
fund.
a lot more.
Yes, because without HELB, he wouldn't have
Yes. And the
gone to
biggest
education.
resource that you can have as a country, as the biggest asset, is people, is the human capital that you build out of all these investments.
Mhm.
Because without knowledgeable people, without educated people, then your future is doomed.
Thank you so much, George, for coming to talk to us on Unequally Yoked, where we talked about the unequal relationships between researchers in the North and in the South. If you want to continue this conversation, you can find me on Twitter at I am Verah Okeyo, on LinkedIn as well. I could direct you to Instagram, but no, we could stick to those two conversations. Thank you.